Thank you, Mr. Wolfowitz and Mr. Armitage. Excellent statements. We appreciate the significant contribution that you have and are making to our nation's security. I would like to call upon Senator Rockefeller for the first round of questions. Senator Rockefeller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Secretary Armitage and Secretary Wolfowitz, for being here. Let me just state at the beginning what Eleanor Hill said yesterday, and that is it was not our intelligence community, it was not the FBI, it was not anybody else that did the killing at the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and in Pennsylvania, other than the terrorists. That rules. Having said that, I'd like to talk a little bit about perceived threats and ask some questions. According to the Department of State publication of Patterns of Global Terrorism, there were 274 international terrorist attacks in 1998 alone, reflecting that the number of attacks, in fact, had been decreasing and were, in fact, at their lowest point since 1971. If we measure the threat of terrorism by the number of Americans killed, and of course, even one death is too much. If we include the attacks on our African embassies, 12 U.S. citizens died in 1998, 54 were killed in the preceding 5 years. In 1999, 5 more Americans died. In 2000, another 19 died, 17 on the USS Cole. These numbers are both tragic, but they show a fairly persistent pattern over the past decade. Even with this consistent pattern of activity, George Tenet, who by most Americans I think is considered to be the person who runs intelligence in this country. We know that not to be true, and I'm going to discuss that. But, you know, the director of Central Intelligence is kind of evokes an image of real control. He was concerned enough, as both of you mentioned, and particularly Secretary Wolfowitz, to mention in 1998 and tell his deputies, and then it was broadly disseminated within the intelligence community, it doesn't say beyond that in our report, that we are at war with al-Qaeda. So my first question is, what did you think that meant, either both of you? What did you think that meant, and what should have happened at that point in your judgment? The reason I asked that question, Secretary Wolfowitz, you talk a lot about things that must happen, things that cannot happen again. We must make sure that such and such doesn't happen again. But specifically, what did that mean, we are at war, to you as you came into office, and what should have happened at that point in your judgment?
Want to go first?
Let me go first, then Secretary Armitage can add. I think it means that you plan for war, and in fact, over the course of, from the time Secretary Armitage was sworn in, which I think was late March of 2001, which was when we finally had 2 deputies and could have a deputies committee. In fact, prior to that, I believe even National Security Advisor Dr. Rice had tasked her staff to begin preparing options for what this would mean. And as you start to look at it, you realize that war against al-Qaeda is something different from going after individual acts of terrorism or retaliating against individual acts of terrorism, that it really does involve all the elements of national power, that it's not just something for the intelligence community alone, that in fact you can't go to war against al-Qaeda without recognizing the role that the government of Afghanistan is playing. You can't go after the government of Afghanistan without recognizing the problems in your relationship, particularly with Pakistan, but with other neighboring countries. And you can't get serious about this without looking at military options. And when you start to look at military options, you have to think about something more than a one-off retaliation for an attack. And that is the process that we're engaged in over the course of basically the summer of 2001. And ironically enough, it led to a Principals Committee meeting in early September before the attacks that produced recommendation that was not far off from what we ultimately implemented after September 11th. Let me emphasize one other point, and that is
12 questions in 20 minutes, so I need brevity to the extent possible.
I'll only add that
I think our story is pretty good on going after al-Qaeda from April 30th on, after the first deputies meeting. However, where we went wrong, and I think where we made a mistake, was that we didn't have first of all, a necessary baseline from intelligence on the global aspects and global possibilities of al-Qaeda, number one. And number two, although many of us, including members of Congress, were saying the right words, I don't think that we really had made the leap in our mind that we're no longer safe behind these two great oceans. And even though we'd had the World Trade Center attack of 1993.
When you came into office, did you both think/know that we were at war with al-Qaeda?
I was briefed in January and February, leading to my hearings in March for the U.S. Senate. The terms "at war" was, to my knowledge or my remembrance, not used. There was no question, though, that we were in a struggle with al-Qaeda, and al-Qaeda was the very first thing that the administration took on at the deputies level.
But you were aware that the DCI thought we were at war?
I was aware of his comments.
Yes. And did the intelligence community clearly warn you what al-Qaeda was capable of doing and that it sought to carry out a mass casualty on U.S. soil? Did you know that? Had you been informed of that by the intelligence community?
The intelligence community, as I recall, informed me, one, that we might have an explosion in Kenya from an explosive-laden aircraft. I do not specifically remember a mass casualty event. However, there were discussions in INR and the State Department from information gleaned from the intelligence community that there was the possibility of a chem-bio attack. No location, no time, but that was being discussed.
What did you two gentlemen perceive the threat to be?
I, in general, perceive the threat to be at our interest overseas, primarily in the Gulf, some in Southeast Asia, and most definitely in Israel. That's from my point of view in the Department of State.
I would say near term, we perceive the threat to be overseas, as Secretary Armitage says. In the mid to longer term, we perceive the threat to be mass casualties in the United States as a result of chemical or biological or conceivably nuclear attack. And that's why, in the course of developing the Quadrennial Defense Review over the summer of 2001, we identified Homeland Security as the top priority for transformation.
Did you take any steps with respect to reacting to these threats that the Clinton administration had not taken at their point in time? Because the 1998 fatwa, the Tenet warning came out in '98.
We increased in INR the number of analysts. We have 14 in general look at terrorism and crime. We increased the number to 8. It's since been increased after 9/11 to 10. So that's a specific answer.
We undertook a number of steps in our development of the defense program to increase our capability to detect or respond to weapons of mass destruction attacks. And I believe there were a number of classified actions taken by other agencies,
Is there anything
specifically against
specific
al-Qaeda.
you can tell us? Unclassified?
No, not with respect to classified actions. Specifics on what we did with respect to developing our own capabilities to respond, I can give you lots of detail for the record.
Please do that. Who, in fact, is responsible for assessing the risk of terrorist attack in the United States of America, and was any strategic assessment or other kind of assessment done when you came into office, both of you?
I think what you're putting your finger on, I think to some extent, is that we have certain divisions of responsibility between what the FBI and domestic law enforcement is responsible for and what the CIA is responsible for, and indeed limitations on what the CIA is allowed to do and collect domestically, which I think members of this committee are very familiar with. So there is a problem of where responsibility is assigned. I'm not aware of any specific assessment of what the threat was domestically.
I agree, sir.
All right. obviously we'd had the 1993 World Trade Center instance, and there'd been a whole series of other things which Eleanor Hill delineated yesterday. So there were things going on in this country over a long period of time. The question was, were they individually aggregated and taken to a higher level where they reached policymakers and said, oh, this is not just a matter of the international, but this is a matter of domestic. So America's perception of threat as here as opposed to overseas was not, you're saying, fully formed when you gentlemen took office.
I think that's a fair statement, but I'd like to accompany it with the notation and the notice that when Mr. Bush was a candidate, he specifically spoke about Homeland Security, and he was drawing on a report that was actually commissioned by the U.S. Congress, the National Defense Panel report, which spoke about Homeland Security being a new mission area, and the Pentagon is on top of that as far as I can see. And second, that we recognize that we couldn't have a policy, certainly in South Asia, as early and more broadly as early as the end of April, when we had a deputies meeting and made decisions and gave instructions to not just roll back Al Qaeda, but to go after and eliminate them.
Thank you. The intelligence community, this is sort of about what you were talking about, Secretary Wolfowitz, collects, analyzes, and disseminates one kind of intelligence for civilian policymakers, and another and different kind for the defense needs to shape our military forces and plan and execute military operations. Many of our intelligence collection systems used to collect both kinds of intelligence. I mean, there's an overlap, and it is well known. No, in fact, it isn't well known generally out there in the country, but it is a fact that 85% of the money of the budget is within or controlled by the Department of Defense. So it's important to understand the different needs, how they overlap, and how they do not, and what happens when there is a conflict between the civilian policy needs and military needs. And to that, I would just give you something to lop on. If Director Tenet foresaw a requirement to make a change, that he needed to have something happen, but that was not under his budget authority, would he have the ability to go into the Department of Defense and take something that he needed in the way of money? Or is it the unwritten law that the Director of Central Intelligence, thought to be the controller of intelligence by most of our country, in fact usually loses when he goes up against the Secretary of Defense?
I don't think that describes the relationship. In fact, I think Secretary Rumsfeld and Director Tenet have a closer relationship than any previous Secretary of Defense in the DCI, and when these issues have come up, this was true before September 11th. It's doubly or triply true now.
Not interested in personal relationships. I'm interested in the question I asked.
It's not a personal matter. It is a working relationship. It is a professional relationship. They meet regularly. These problems get resolved. We have frequently moved resources to address their needs. But I think a fundamental point, too, here, Senator, related to a lot of these questions, is this is not a game we will ever win on defense. We'll only win it on offense. And I believe that recognition came very early in this administration, and the recognition that going on offense was something that would be a very substantial exercise.
Thank you.
Mr. Secretary?
Absolutely.
Okay. Under the current structure, I think it's fair to say that the Director of Central Intelligence, thought by the American people to sort of control intelligence, doesn't. And I'm not arguing that point. But I'm raising, I don't think there have been any recent Central Intelligence directors who have really wanted to venture beyond their budget authority. And their budget authority is fundamentally 15% of the intelligence budget. So that it raises all kinds of questions about the relationship between the DCI and the DOD, which you say is very good. And I've been at the meetings when people have had their arms around each other. We're working very well together. But it doesn't seem to work out necessarily to the best coordination of intelligence activities. It seems to me that, in fact, that any DCI lacks that authority, is not necessarily willing to take on a Secretary of Defense who controls budgets and personnel. And if there is any truth in either of your minds in this, does that, in your judgment, hinder the fight against terrorism?
Senator, I don't think it's a matter of taking on the Secretary of Defense. I think there are times when it would be helpful, and this is why we've proposed an Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence, when the director has a problem or when his subordinates have a problem, to be able to come to somebody below the level of the secretary and get these problems sorted out. When problems are elevated, my experience has been they have been resolved, and I don't think there are basic problems here that flow from some inability of the Director of Central Intelligence to get from the Department of Defense what they need. But a basic point, which I think the American people also expect, is that these vast intelligence resources of ours will be made available to permit our military to win wars when they fight them. And the intelligence resources of the Defense Department have been absolutely critical in this campaign against terrorism.
And I agree with what you've said, and I also note that in your testimony you talked about stovepiping, and you talked about the proposed new Secretary for Intelligence. And I'd like to ask your question: how do you think that this is going to help bring clarity, succinctness, precision, sequential accuracy to the variety of 10 or 11 different intelligence agencies which exist, but which have no sort of central command, even though the American people think it's that way? How will this proposed new secretary be able to bring clarity to the process of the gathering, dissemination, assessment, strategic assessment of that intelligence?
I think the key to breaking down stovepipes is to bring them together at levels below the very top level of the government. When the only place they come together is at the cabinet level, then inevitably there are going to be walls and compartments that busy cabinet officers don't have the time to break down. Having an Undersecretary for Intelligence whose sole responsibility is overseeing those agencies and precisely looking at those compartments and stovepipes, I think, is a key to doing it. In the Rumsfeld Commission, looking at the ballistic missile threat, 9 of us working part-time were able to do an enormous amount of breaking down stovepipes, but it requires people who are focused on that issue and not distracted by many other things. That's what an Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence will be able to do.
Talking about stovepipes is something that the intelligence community and this committee has done for a very, very long time, and we've seen not much progress. So when you say getting people together at a lower level, I'm pleased to hear that. Could you elaborate a little bit on how you really break down a culture of non-communication, of individual campuses spread around within a 3 to 6 mile radius of Congress, which all have their own cultures, their own memorial gardens, their own cafeterias, their own set of histories? I mean, it's an easy thing to talk about, a hard thing to do. What do you think about? I mean, how do you think this should be made to happen, Secretary Wolfowitz?
Let me try to split in 2 different problems. I think, first of all, there is, before you get into the culture problem, there's just simple problems of compartmentation. One reason that the Rumsfeld Commission was able to break down a lot of stovepipes is that we had the authority to go into every compartment, and we could see that information in one compartment was something that people in another compartment needed to have and weren't getting. And that's not a culture issue. That is somebody with the oversight, the ability, and the time to look into those compartments that can break them down. You raise a bigger question, which is culture. You don't change those things overnight, nor do you want to change them entirely. I mean, you need organizations with specialized capabilities. I think, though, we've seen a lot over just the last 12 months of agencies, including agencies that are not traditionally work together. The FBI, for example, has brought CIA analysts into the FBI. That's a rather radical change. How much it's changing the FBI, you'd have to ask the FBI director or the CIA director.
Let me use that statement to go into my final question. Regarding the FBI, from my point of view, I really question, I'd like both of your responses on this, whether the FBI ought to be heavily involved in the intelligence business. They're trained differently. Their skill sets are totally different. Their habits are different. Everything is different about them. They do a superb job at prosecuting, putting people in jail, finding this. But the intelligence thing on a domestic basis, which raises, serious questions of what would an alternative be, which is what we need to discuss, is something that I worry about a lot. You indicated the FBI reported to you, but was the FBI really monitoring some of these domestic groups in a way which was satisfactory to you? Did they have the mindset, skill set to do that?
I'm going to give you two answers. One is a prospective senator. I was involved in the setting up of the CTC in the mid-'80s, and there's been a light years difference between the FBI now and the FBI then. But the direct answer to your question is absolutely. The FBI must be more than an investigation and prosecutorial arm who comes in after an event. They have to be involved in the investigation and the monitoring. There's no way around it, nor should there be.
My time is up. I thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you, Senator Rockefeller.